SynchroMystique Presents. Is there a magical powder or stone with the power of turning lead into gold? Is there a potion capable of prolonging life indefinitely? In the wake of pandemics and rising prices, these questions are perhaps more pressing now than ever before. Surely the answer to both is no, right? Dotting the timeline of history, like embedded gold ore, are a minority of dissenters who not only answer a resounding yes, but who also claim to have developed repeatable techniques for accomplishing these and other fabulous ends. Of course, we're speaking here about the diverse cluster of men and women who engaged in a storied discipline known as alchemy. Generally working alone and in secret, these alchemists communicated with one another in code. They took pains to shroud their beliefs, and more importantly, their methods, under a veil of elaborate and even grotesque symbolism. The received view is that these practitioners were largely deluded and superstitious failures, who misspent their lives on chimeric quests, but who managed, with their fledgling efforts, to pave the way for the advent of science, which has now cleared the field of these ill-educated dilettantes. And yet, whispers remain about a select group who may have achieved the impossible. The term alchemy is one striking example of a fascinating family of still current words whose origins and primary meanings are shrouded in mystery. Among the etymological candidates is the root chemia, which may have been an ancient reference to Egypt, sometimes provocatively labeled the gay science. Alchemy, which is conspicuously preoccupied with quasi-miraculous changes known as transmutations, is commonly represented as divine chemistry. Alchemical formulae purport to provide something like a recipe for elemental transformation. And these lofty pretensions are not for nothing. The art and science of alchemy was said to have been primordially and supernaturally communicated to humankind by otherworldly beings. The legendary Hermes Trismegistus is one of the earliest initiates, if not the source of this tradition, at least in the West. In the first place, Hermes is a reference to the Greek god of communication. Hermes and his Roman counterpart Mercury are frequently further identified with the Egyptian god Thoth. In this sense, Hermes was believed to have been the fountainhead of all the esoterica associated with Egypt. But Hermes Trismegistus, via many mythical and contradictory genealogies, is also said to have been a contemporary and possible teacher of the biblical patriarch Moses. He therefore leads a kind of double life, here being identified with a presumably human initiate who became a proficient sorcerer. Trismegistus means 3 times great and celebrates Hermes' alleged mastery over a trio of disciplines: alchemy, astrology, and magic, that make up a system known as Hermeticism. For an introduction, see 10 arcane words. While the last 2 of these disciplines will have to occupy us another time, we note that the first, alchemy, influenced the development of numerous fields that now function as self-contained sciences. Among the most important of these is modern physics, which, before the era of Albert Einstein, was dominated by the theories of the 17th to 18th century English polymath Sir Isaac Newton. According to researchers at Cambridge University in Britain, where once upon a time Newton himself held a prestigious position as head of the mathematics department, of Newton's surviving writings, no fewer than 1 million words, or 10% of his voluminous output, were devoted to his study of alchemy. Chemistry is another of the so-called hard sciences that owes a huge debt to alchemy. Here, we'll name 17th century figures like Belgian physician Jan Baptiste van Helmont, and, again in England, Sir Robert Boyle. Boyle was one of the founders of England's Royal Society and is sometimes regarded as the father of modern chemistry. Perhaps most surprisingly, alchemy also informed the investigations of pioneering thinkers operating in sciences that are often considered to be softer. For example, the 19th to 20th century Swiss psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung created a strand of depth psychology that notably diverged from that of his teacher, the Austrian Jewish founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud. Among the elements that differentiated this Jungian analytic approach from its Freudian parent was its originator's fascination with, and use of the symbolism of medieval alchemy. Jung was inspired by the writings of figures like the 3rd to 4th century Greco-Egyptian alchemist Zosimus of Panopolis, and the 16th century Belgian Renaissance thinker Gerhard Dorn, who employed chemical symbols and analogies to describe a process of psychological transformation. What is it about this subject that so captivated these and other undisputed geniuses? In this video, we'll lay some historical groundwork for an answer by looking at 10 people with enduring reputations for having been able to command nature itself by becoming adepts of alchemy. Among people who are most famous for their connections to alchemy, perhaps none has achieved the renown enjoyed by the remarkable 14th to 15th century Frenchman Nicolas Flamel. As a side note, in the video titled 10 Sex Magic Cults, we introduced viewers to the possibility that the name Nicolas is a preeminent name of power. As a first pass, this means that you may expect it to appear, like in the present context, as a landmark for high strangeness. Most historians will attest that Nicolas Flamel was indisputably a real person. The burning question, however, is whether the flesh and blood man managed to realize two of the main alchemical goals: the creation of limitless wealth by means of the fabled Philosopher's Stone, and two, the attainment of immortality through the so-called elixir of life, both of which are the result of a glamorous but hazy process termed the magnum opus, or the great work. On the prevailing scholarly view, the historical Flamel was a run-of-the-mill manuscript salesman who had his life story fancifully embellished by 17th century chroniclers. But legend has it that in 1357, Flamel acquired a copy of an enigmatic spellbook, or grimoire, known as the Book of Abramelin the Mage. Among myriad curious magical squares, the book specified rituals which would later become part of the erotically suffused system of notorious 20th century British esotericist Aleister Crowley, whom we highlighted in both our Top 10 Occultists and 10 Sex Magic Cults videos. Flamel reportedly spent 2 fruitless decades attempting to decipher the seemingly impenetrable text with his wife, Paracelsus, before deciding to travel in search of a knowledgeable interpreter. Spain was the logical place to seek such a venerable sage since, until the tail end of the 15th century, it had the distinction of being one of the very few feasible European destinations where adherents of the big 3 religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, coexisted. Flamel supposedly cracked Abramelin's secrets with the help of a Jewish converso, that is, a Jew who had converted to Catholicism, during a chance encounter while on his Iberian tour. By 1382, the Flamels were supposedly capable of producing silver and gold using the decrypted formulae. Beyond his significance for fellow occult practitioners, Nicolas Flamel's impact has been most noticeable in the arenas of arts, entertainment, and literature, where he has several noteworthy mentions. In his masterful 1831 novel, Notre Dame du Paris, better known as the Hunchback of Notre Dame, French romantic novelist Victor Hugo gives his villain, Monseigneur Claude Frollo, an insatiable lust for knowledge. This leads Frollo to pore over various Hermetic insignia attributed to Flamel and carved throughout Paris's Holy Innocents Cemetery. Hugo's American contemporary, the Confederate general and high-ranking Freemason Albert Pike, connected Nicolas Flamel with 13th to 14th century Italian poet Dante Alighieri. For more on Pike, who, in his capacity as sovereign Grand Commander of the Order, rewrote the rituals for the Scottish Rite's so-called Southern jurisdiction. See our Top 10 Occultists presentation. Finally, on the current scene, Nicolas Flamel is mentioned throughout J.K. Rowling's first installment in what would later become the wildly successful Harry Potter franchise. In the United States, her debut novel was labeled Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, but in the United Kingdom, it bore the unmistakably alchemical title Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Flamel is introduced into Rowling's story as a 665-year-old French wizard who had unlocked the secrets of longevity and who was the only known maker of the Philosopher's Stone. Alchemical histories are interlaced with fable to such an extent that it is difficult to disentangle the strands. Be that as it may, some names crop up repeatedly. One such, and a possible candidate for the founder of the entire enterprise, at least as Westerners think of it, is the Greco-Egyptian woman remembered as Maria, the Jewess. Her appellation is exceedingly interesting, not least because a principal stream of Western occultism, namely the Kabbalah, coalesced partly out of Jewish mystical currents. Competing accounts place Maria variously in Memphis, Egypt during the 5th century BC, or in Alexandria in the 3rd century BC. There is even a persistent legend that she was Miriam, the sister of Hebrew patriarch Moses. She is credited with the invention of alchemical paraphernalia. For example, the Bain-Marie, the French phrase which translates Mary's bath, denotes a double boiler that is still used in industry and cooking. Her distillation vessel, called a keratokis, incorporated copper foil, which at a point in the alchemical process changed colors, giving the impression that it was taking on the spirit of gold. In fact, liquor distillers, among others, retain some of the alchemical lingo and routinely refer to various alcoholic preparations as spirits. Suffice it to say that Maria's legacy of devices and reputed knowledge resulted in her commemoration as one of the few alchemists who had managed to create the Philosopher's Stone. The so-called Dark Ages, spanning roughly from the 5th to 10th centuries, began with the fall of the Roman Empire and the cessation of the study of the Greek language. This period is characterized by a marked decline of learning in general. For example, 2 giants of Greek philosophy had been Plato and his pupil Aristotle. Whereas the former would continue to enjoy influence, at least in the spiritualized form of Neoplatonism, the latter went into almost total eclipse for over 500 years. One of the chief contributions of the Islamic civilization to the world is its preservation of Greek philosophy through this Western downturn. Therefore, it is unsurprising to find that alchemy next surfaces in an Arabic context. A principal figure is sometimes designated al-Sufi, but is more commonly known as Jabir ibn Hayyan. Jabir expanded Aristotle's doctrine that the cosmos is composed of various arrangements of 4 basic elements: earth, air, water, and fire, along with 2 pairs of complementary qualities. This basic Aristotelian framework served to underwrite the procedures of alchemy, not to mention Galenic medicine, which centered on the closely related concept of the 4 humors. The idea was that if things, such as metals, are what they are in virtue of the peculiar ratios of elements and qualities, then knowledgeable artisans could change one thing into another by manipulating these sometimes hidden natures. Jabir is, however, somewhat critical of these explanations and began to move toward an alternate theory. On his replacement view, the basic constituents of matter were sulfur and mercury. Later, Paracelsus would add philosophic salt and develop the theory of the 3 principles, or tria prima. At least part of the material description for reality would have to invoke this triplet. With respect to gold, our Arabic adept professed that 2 transmutations were possible: a temporary one, which only modified the superficial or accidental properties of a base metal, and a permanent one, which, to borrow Catholic Eucharistic lingo, transubstantiated, or changed the underlying essence. We might illustrate the difference by distinguishing gold plating from solid gold. Jabir's identity was later assumed by at least one anonymous author. To this unknown writer, termed Pseudo-Jabir, is owed an alchemical treatise, the title of which is variously translated The Height of Perfect Mastery, or the Sum of Perfection. Much of the Jabirian corpus is written usually with a cipher strategy known as the dispersion of knowledge technique, whereby passages are reproduced out of their proper order, like cooking directions that have been scrambled. Thus, possession of an alchemical text by itself, without the proper key, does little good, even if a reader can decode individual symbols. In fact, according to the famed English lexicographer Samuel Johnson, our English word, gibberish, which means unintelligible or meaningless speech or writing, literally comes from the Latinized spelling of Jabir's name. This paranoid secrecy, which resulted in incomprehensible texts, was partly due to the fact that alchemical knowledge was frequently considered heterodox, even heretical, by mainstream adherents of the 3 major monotheistic religions. But it was also because of the fear that the gold-making and life-extending potential of the Philosopher's Stone, were it to become too widely known, would undermine the proper order of society. Fear of being labeled a heretic may have been off-putting for most would-be alchemists, but not for everyone. Among those who sought recondite information, despite the risk, was the 15th century English Augustinian canon, George Ripley. Ripley is one of a handful of people that allegedly achieved alchemical adeptness. at least according to Freemasonic scholar Manly Palmer Hall. According to Hall, Ripley's wonder-working was confirmed by the fact that he contributed 100,000 pounds of gold to the Knights of Rhodes, who later became the Knights of Malta, so that they could continue their war against the Turks. In his important poetic volume, The Compound of Alchemy, Ripley adopted an allegorical approach to his titular subject. He compared an adept's completion of the magnum opus to passage through 12 gates. This metaphor, which treats the great work as a kind of spiritual obstacle course, became the basis for a division of the alchemical process into 12 stages. That Ripley was an Augustinian hints at what you might call a Catholic connection to alchemy that goes back at least to the 12th century. Scholastic theologian and Catholic Bishop of Lincoln, Robert Grosseteste, is sometimes named on rosters of alchemists, as was his most illustrious student, the 13th century Franciscan friar and proto-empiricist, Roger Bacon. German-born Dominican Saint Albert the Great was said to have composed an alchemical spellbook called the Grand Albert, similarly to St. Patrick, who, according to legend, drove the snakes out of Ireland. Albert had a magical serpent stone that enabled him to locate and get rid of the slithering pests. Albert the Great supposedly developed procedures for testing alleged specimens of alchemically produced silver and gold. This is important because it is commonly assumed that to many medievals, if a substance was the color of gold, then it was believed to be gold. Albert is associated with the city of Cölln, where his system of thought, a blend of Aristotelianism and Neoplatonism, sometimes called Albertism, would influence the mystic Meister Eckhart, as well as the polymath and out-and-out occultist Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa. This is especially noteworthy, since according to 20th century British historian Francis Amelia Yates, it is with Cornelius Agrippa that alchemy very decidedly enters the Hermetic Kabbalist tradition as it came to expression during the Renaissance. Albert, or according to the strictures of contemporary textual criticism, Pseudo-Albert, is said to have codified 8 preconditions for would-be creators of the Philosopher's Stone, including the ability to, well, keep your mouth shut. Additionally, Albert the Great was rumored to have been in possession of the Philosopher's Stone. He is said to have passed its secrets to his best-known student, the precocious Dominican St. Thomas Aquinas, whose Summa Theologica, or Comprehensive Summary of Theology, revolutionized Catholic philosophical instruction and became the foundation for later publications, including the important Catechism of the Catholic Church. An alchemical treatise titled the Aurora Consurgens, Rising Dawn, is sometimes attributed to St. Thomas, leading to his occasional classification as a Hermetic initiate. Not that Catholics corner the market on this sort of endeavor. As we have seen, there was no shortage of Arabic Muslim influence, and it is arguable, for example, from the case of Maria the Jewess, that the whole enterprise was at least partially informed by Hebraic mystical currents as well. And this influence continued unabated until, or was at least renewed during, the Renaissance. One of the principal figures credited with tuning Europe onto a Hermetic wavelength was the legendary Salomon Trismosin. Trismosin, whose name is probably a pseudonym, is said to have had his alchemical curiosities piqued after a chance meeting with an otherwise unknown alchemist named Flocker. After witnessing the metamorphosis of lead into gold, but without being able to wrest the secret from Flocker, Trismosin threw himself into a lifelong investigation for the formula of the Philosopher's Stone. His travels took him to Venice, Italy, where he apprenticed to an itinerant German master named Tauler, and finally learned the key to transmutation. According to Franz Hartmann, the 19th to 20th century German occultist and co-founder with Karl Kellner and Theodor Reuss of the Ordo Templi Orientis, Trismosin also managed to discover the elixir of everlasting life. One of Trismosin's lasting contributions was the gorgeous illuminated manuscript titled Splendor Solis, the sun's splendor. The beautifully colored illustrations are some of the most recognizable representations of alchemy extant. Because of the secrecy surrounding the art, alchemical engravings frequently stand alone with little to no explanation. An extreme case of this is the Mutus Liber, or the Silent Book. The book is so named because it contains virtually no text at all. It is worth remarking that such works, whether handwritten or typeset, left tremendous impressions, sometimes changing European history for good, or ill. Consider the works of the possibly fictional alchemist Bernard of Treviso. They were rumored to have exerted a formative influence upon Joan of Arc's 15th century companion and later diabolist and serial killer, Gilles de Rais. According to the 20th century English Catholic scholar and priest Montague Summers, the highly influential 19th century French occultist Eliphas Lévy said, quote, Gilles de Rais sought the philosophical stone in the blood of murdered children. Recall that the elusive philosopher's stone is oftentimes described as a blood-red powder that transmutes base metal into purest gold. One of Salomon Trismosin's proverbial claims to fame was undoubtedly the power he exerted over that man who has been dubbed the Martin Luther of medicine. In fact, the scientific debates of the late 16th century were centered more frequently on this man's innovations than they were on the heliocentric astronomy of Copernicus. I'm speaking now of the pioneering anti-Galenic physician born Theophrastus von Hohenheim, but better known as Paracelsus. In the ancient world, Western alchemy was based on the Hermetic tradition and consisted of a syncretism of Egyptian metallurgy and magic, along with Greek Neoplatonism and Jewish Christian Gnosticism. But under Paracelsus's influence, European Renaissance alchemy started to assume the characteristics of what we would today think of as chemistry, homeopathy, pharmacology, and surgery. Although he rejected medical explanations framed exclusively in terms of the four humors, he was by no means anti-alchemical. On the contrary, he simply believed that the three primes, mercury, sulfur, and salt, were more relevant to health than were the four elements. The philosopher's stone was a combination of the tria prima in their purest forms. From his perspective, alchemy is a set of procedures for speeding up natural processes of physical and spiritual healing. Metals evolve toward gold, just as all life evolves toward divine perfection. In this respect, Paracelsus was the opposite of the Gilles de Rais. To Paracelsus, alchemy's goal should be medicine, but chemically prepared medicines would work only if the physician first understood the relationship between the patient, the cosmos, and God. An essential key to that understanding lay in the study of alchemy. The Hermetic philosopher holds that human beings are miniature versions, or microcosms, of the entire universe, which is the macrocosm. There are meaningful, albeit hidden, correspondences between lower level and higher level realities. This is the significance of the famous alchemical maxim, as above, so below, which is expressed in the so-called Emerald Tablet. For his part, Paracelsus claimed to have received the final secrets of the great work in Constantinople, which has been a pivotal crypto-political node for centuries. A famous drawing of Paracelsus shows him grasping an upside-down sword by its hilt, with the word Azoth engraved on the pommel. The well-known 19th century French occultist Eliphas Lévy likened the Azoth, also called the panacea or the universal medicine, to a mysterious fabled fifth element called the quintessence. According to Lévy, the Azoth is a combination of gold and light. Enthusiasts have considered these dense and obscure claims worthy of reflection, since according to Paracelsus, therein lies the key to creating spiritual gold. It is now commonly asserted that the great work was mostly concerned with the spiritual transformation of the alchemist himself. This psychological interpretation of the magnum opus, popularized in our time by the aforementioned Carl Jung, has been a live option since at least the days of Nicolas Flamel. Following Flamel and his immediate successor George Ripley, a distinction was often made between true adepts on the one hand and mere blowers or puffers on the other. The latter designations were terms of disparagement for practitioners whose undisciplined fondness for gold debased the high-minded art of alchemy and turned it into a mere get-rich-quick scheme. Does that mean that Paracelsus was unconcerned with physical gold? Who can say? Speculation abounds as to whether Paracelsus cracked the ultimate code, but upon his alleged death in 1541, more than a few suggested that the alchemist had found the elixir of life and given himself a dose of immortality. Paracelsus had a number of intellectual successors, including Gerhard Dorn, who exerted the powerful influence on Carl Jung, Oswald Kroll, who had contact with John Dee's collaborator, Edward Kelly, Jan Baptiste van Helmont, and Valentine Weigel. Following Paracelsian doctrine, they all, in one way or other, came to believe that the book of nature could be just as illuminating as the Holy Bible, and held just as many secrets. Like Maria the Jewess, Salomon Trismosin, and several others on this list, Basil Valentine is the subject of many, sometimes conflicting stories. Depending upon the report, he is said to have lived anywhere between the 12th and 15th centuries, or even beyond. According to one persistent legend, Basil Valentine was a Benedictine monk, though revisionist biographers have begun identifying him with a German salt miner named Johann Tolde. In any event, he cultivated a reputation for obscure learning that issued in equally enigmatic texts, including the Great Stone of the Philosophers, that is, the 12 Keys of Philosophy. In 1618, Rosicrucian sympathizer Michael Meyer published an illustrated version of the 12 Keys under the title The Golden Tripod. Like Paracelsus, Arnaldus de Villanova, and others, Valentine was an early medical experimenter and critic of the Galenic establishment. Also, like Paracelsus, he picked up on the Azoth current. This is evident from one of the most recognizable alchemical diagrams that is owed to Basil Valentine. It is a prominent illustration in the work titled Azoth of the Philosophers. According to writer Dennis William Houck, Azoth is an alpha-omega symbol and hints obliquely at the chaotic first matter at the beginning of the alchemical work and the perfected stone at its conclusion. The Azoth is believed to be the animating energy, or spiritus animatus, of the body, and it is crucial in the gold-making endeavor, as occultist Franz Hartmann explains. This spirit, the prime mover, is the great alchemical agent. If this spirit is extracted from gold and united with some other metal, it transforms the latter into gold. Much of the symbolism of alchemy was subsequently imported into the 17th century Rosicrucian movement. Special mention should be made of Johann Valentine Andreae, Christopher Besoldus, and Tobias Hess, the possible authors of the Rosicrucian manifestos, published between 1614 and 1617. But among the Rosicrucian apologists, we must also count English Paracelsian doctor Robert Flood, German Hermeticist Heinrich Kuhnroth, and Michael Meyer, whose alchemical epigrams were famously printed in the volume titled Atalanta Fleeing, alongside gorgeous illustrations by Matthias Marion. Not quite a relic of bygone eras, a handful of quirky personalities have also appeared to continue Basil Valentine's legacy. One of these was the French adept known only as Fulcanelli, which name is ostensibly a mashup of Vulcan, the god of the forge in classical Roman mythology, and El, a Semitic word for God. Fulcanelli appeared as the byline in a 1926 book titled The Mystery of the Cathedrals. According to its author, medieval stonemasons preserved the formula for the magnum opus through decorations in the great churches of Europe. Fulcanelli has inspired a host of contemporary writers, including esotericist J. Weidner. And according to Fulcanelli's protege, Eugene Leon Cancelier, Fulcanelli's theoretical teacher, whether through books or via some miraculous attainment of old age, had been none other than Basil Valentine. In his own day, Alexander Seton was believed to be one of those very few alchemists, reportedly, who succeeded in the great experiment of the transmutation of metals. It is for this very reason that Seton's story also serves as a cautionary tale for would-be gold makers. The story begins in 1601, when a Dutch boat shipwrecked off the coast of Scotland. By chance, the ill-fated vessel had crashed near Seton's home. At personal risk, Seton rescued many of the sailors and nursed them back to health. One of the survivors, a pilot named James Housen, was thankful to the point of offering to host Seton for a vacation in his native Holland. During the trip, Seton disclosed to Housen that he was a master of alchemy and proved his words by performing several transmutations. Apparently, Seton continued to tour continental Europe, and he continued also injudiciously displaying his much-coveted talents along the way. Some of these alleged exhibitions, if the stories are true, are among the most remarkable accounts of their kinds. Unlike scores of seeming charlatans, Alexander Seton appeared transparent to onlookers. He was said to have invited crowd participation. Spectators brought their own lead. Chemical equipment was brought by disinterested third parties, such as town apothecaries and smithies. Seton himself purportedly touched nothing. He merely directed the action, as it were, and the results of this process were immediately available to sometimes antecedently skeptical contributors for close inspection. Contrast this with the much later case of the miserable 18th century British chemist James Price. Using his own powder of projection, Price staged 7 well-attended transmutation exhibitions. Reportedly, King George III was even made aware of Price's activities. But when challenged to repeat his carefully choreographed lead-into-gold demonstrations in front of a more scrutinous, scientifically minded audience, composed of fellows from the Royal Society, Price opted instead to commit suicide. By comparison, Seton's procedures were most impressive to audiences of his era. Unfortunately, word of these spectacular feats reached powerful and unscrupulous characters, including the avaricious Christian II, Elector of Saxony from 1591 to 1611. Christian summoned Seton to his court. Ultimately, he ended up imprisoned in Christian's Tower. According to Manly Palmer Hall, Seton was pierced with pointed iron, scorched with molten lead, burned with fire, beaten with rods, and racked from head to foot, yet he refused to betray his God-given knowledge. Enter Michael Sendivogius. Sendivogius was born into a family of means. The official account has it that he was moved by the plight of the hapless Seton and used his influence to gain access to the prisoner. During their tete-a-tete, Sendivogius supposedly proposed staging a jailbreak in exchange for Seton's alchemical secret. The plan was then put into place with the help of strategic bribes, and after plying the guards with food and drink, Seton was freed. No longer under duress, Seton refused to divulge his gold-making recipe and soon died from the trauma and abuse sustained during his imprisonment. But before he expired, Seton entrusted to Sendivogius his stock of the so-called projection catalyst, that is, the scarce red powder which is also called the Philosopher's Stone. Eventually, Sendivogius gravitated to the city of Prague and to the Bohemian court of Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II. During his reign, Prague was recognized as the metropolis of alchemy. It is said that Sendivogius used Seton's magic powder to effect numerous genuine transmutations. The standard line is that without the all-important formula, he was operating on borrowed time. Desperate to unearth the preparation instructions, he accosted Seton's widow on the assumption that she knew something of her husband's techniques. Being unsuccessful at that interrogation, Sendivogius absconded with a manuscript in Seton's hand bearing the title The New Light of Alchemy. In its pages, he thought he saw a method for increasing the powder, but he succeeded only in lessening it. Doubtless bitter and perhaps desperate for money, Sendivogius published New Light under his own name and died among the ranks of pretenders. At least, such is the fate as most biographers have assumed. Did Sendivogius really meet a bad end after exhausting his supply of the powder of projection bequeathed to him by Seton? Freemasonic scholar Manly Palmer Hall wasn't so sure. According to Hall, Sendivogius may have known the ultimate secret of alchemy after all. For one thing, Sendivogius was greatly esteemed by 17th century alchemist John Frederick Schweitzer, better known as Helvetius, personal physician to William of Orange. Helvetius himself had a reputation as a gold-making alchemist. Moreover, Sendivogius may have been the real-life identity of the secret adept that Rosicrucian Michael Meyer placed in his list of 12 supreme initiates. The thought is that it would have been odd for Hermetic cognoscenti like Helvetius and Meyer to have admired a hack. Like Alexander Seton, Sendivogius was imprisoned for his alleged knowledge, in this case by Duke Friedrich I of Württemberg, another of the supporters of alchemy hailing from noble families and himself a recent initiate of the strange, England-based Order of the Garter. For more on that order, whose membership is tightly controlled and usually restricted to royal family members such as Prince Andrew, see our video, 10 Sex Magic Cults. Sendivogius was also keyed in on esoteric political currents. He is said to have brokered meetings between Elizabethan occultists John Dee and Edward Kelly and Transylvanian king Stephen Bathory. Stephen was the uncle of infamous accused murderess Countess Elizabeth Bathory. Not only this, but Sendivogius may also have been an initiate of the Society of the Rosy Cross, the Rosicrucians, and may have been an important member of the even more mysterious Society of the Unknown Philosophers. These societies may have functioned as adjuncts to a far-flung network of transgressive thinkers that fancied itself the Invisible College. And that brings us to the early days of British America and to the last entry on our list. George Starkey has the distinction of being the primary American alchemist of note, and this of course would have been British America. Like Paracelsus, Jan van Helmont, and Helvetius, he was a physician by training. In fact, Starkey received his medical instruction at Harvard during the 1640s, just a few years after its founding in 1636. Starkey decamped from Boston to London to find an intellectually stimulating environment more congenial to his esoteric interests. As an aside, and according to researcher Jim Allison, Boston and London are geodetically positioned along the same mystically significant Great Circle. This idea is an extension of the concept pioneered by Alfred Watkins of terrestrial alignments termed ley lines, which can be thought of as planetary equivalents of anatomical acupuncture points. Once in London, Starkey associated with the great chemist Robert Boyle. Boyle was a mixed bag. Boyle opposed superstitions that he believed couldn't be taken seriously in the wake of the emergence of mechanistic science. Yet, when it came to the transmutation of metals, Boyle was a believer to the core. All his life, he remained committed to the idea of transmuting gold. It's from Boyle that we know of the existence of the so-called Invisible College. That institution deserves its own treatment. Suffice it to say that it was a blend of an intelligence network and a secret society. But it was its empiricist bent that made this early scientific institution a precursor to the Royal Society. As a token of goodwill, and likely to impress his European collaborators, Starkey produced manuscripts bearing the name Irenaeus Philalethes, which is Greek for peaceful lover of truth. The authorship of the Philalethes manuscripts has never been firmly established, but most scholars are of the opinion that George Starkey wrote the books himself. Starkey appeared to have gone bankrupt in a single-minded pursuit of wealth creation. He alienated his English colleagues and for a time was reduced to experimenting in the cell of a debtor's prison. He managed to secure a release but died shortly after an outbreak of bubonic plague in London. It seems that in 1665, he and fellow physician George Thomson dissected a pestilent corpse to gain medical insight. The dissection was ridiculed by the reigning medical establishment. When Starkey passed, following the attempt, naysayers disparaged Starkey with exaggerated stories about how his death had come within minutes of performing what was regarded as an idiotic procedure. Weirdly, Freemasonry now includes a ritual referred to by the same word, autopsy, which is in wide use to designate the common operation for which Starkey was lambasted. Due at least partly to his abrasive and contentious personality, Starkey has a generally poor reputation, even among esoteric writers. Freemasonic scholar Manly Palmer Hall describes him as of unsound character. Still, it was through the work of Starkey, filtered through Boyle, that the young Isaac Newton had his alchemical interests sparked. Newton's Hermetic library would eventually grow to become one of the largest in the world. Starkey is also of interest because of his possible connection to the shadowy Thomas Vaughan. According to the usual retelling, Thomas Vaughan was born in Wales in 1621. He studied to become a physician, but never practiced that profession, preferring instead to devote himself to alchemy. Vaughan seems to have adopted the pseudonym Eugenius Philalethes, under which he published several Hermetic treatises. He is especially interesting because of his candor. Supposedly, Vaughan died childless when one of his dangerous experiments went horribly awry. However, in the late 19th century, a strange and suspicious character, calling himself Leo Taxil, claimed acquaintance with one Diana Vaughan, a supposed descendant of Thomas Vaughan. Peeling back the layers, we find a veritable onion of intrigue. Not only is it unclear whether Diana Vaughan had any relation to Thomas Vaughan, it is not even certain that Diana Vaughan existed at all, outside Taxil's imagination, notwithstanding a curious photo purporting to depict Diana dressed in a man's suit. Nevertheless, Diana Vaughan alleged that she had first-hand knowledge of a group of high-ranking Freemasons, led by Scottish Rite Kingpin Albert Pike, who were involved in a sex-loving satanic organization called the Palladian Society, or the Order of the Palladium. An account of this Luciferian Freemasonry was published in the sensational 1892 book, The Devil in the 19th Century, under the possibly fictitious name Dr. Bataille. Taxil later claimed that the whole affair had been an elaborate hoax. Because his reversal is taken as the final word on the matter, the entire fiasco is dismissed as the Taxil hoax. and Diana Vaughan, if her existence is admitted at all, is derided as a fraud. Once again, however, Manly P. Hall offers a dissenting opinion, writing, quote, "It is quite possible that Miss Vaughan's scholarship was more penetrating than her detractors would like to admit." Among the claims to which Manly Hall gives some credence is Diana Vaughan's assertion that Thomas Vaughan was part of a line of Rosicrucian initiates that included Johann Valentin Andrei, Elias Ashmole, John Amos Comenius, Robert Flood, and Helvetius. Most intriguingly, according to Diana Vaughan, Thomas made at least 2 visits to America, where he may have been received as Philalethes, with the grandiose title President of the Illuminated of Europe. Hall also seriously considers the possibility that the alchemical adept George Starkey allegedly encountered in the early days of colonial America had been Thomas Vaughan. If true, this would mean that the alchemical manuscripts of Thomas Vaughan incalculably shaped thinkers such as Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton, both towering figures standing at the birth of modern science. We conclude this strange, even incredible episode with Manly Hall's further speculation that Thomas Vaughan retired to a hidden monastery somewhere along the banks of the Danube River in Europe and lived there among Protestant monks who were formerly Catholic Cistercians. Where does it all lead? What significance could this motley assortment of eccentrics have for us? By way of reply, we should note that gold making has not only intrigued individuals, but entire governments as well. Many rulers have sought the power of the mythic King Midas, even though, in the legend, his golden touch turned into a curse. During the Age of Discovery, King Ferdinand of Spain allegedly told his South American explorers, quote, "Get gold, humanely if you can, but at all hazards, get gold." Regents like Edward III of England, James IV of Scotland, and Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II were among the array of monarchs with more than passing interests in funding gold-making attempts. It would be easy to suppose that these aspirations have gone the way of the dinosaur, but would you believe a case can be made that fabled alchemy inspired modern finance? Consider as a first pass Hungarian-born American financier George Soros. Provocatively, he titled his 1987 book, The Alchemy of Finance. And remember, at birth, his surname was Schwartz. Soros was adopted by the family as a change name in the 1930s during the rise of National Socialism. In the Book of Abramelin, which you'll recall supposedly made possible Nicolas Flamel's marvelous attainment of old age and wealth, there is a formula for the acquisition of gold coin money. Prominently displayed in the center of that magic square are the letters SOROS. We have no word on whether the Soros family was familiar with Abramelin the Mage, but it is well known that George became world famous in 1992 when he made $1 billion by using an investment tactic called short selling to become the man who broke the Bank of England. The Bank of England is the British progenitor of the United States' Federal Reserve. It was formed in 1694 to institutionalize a money-lending procedure called fractional reserve banking. Without getting too technical, the fractional reserve system allows money changers to lend out more than they actually have in their vaults. In other words, through the magic of fractional reserves, bankers are literally authorized to create money out of thin air. It has a very alchemical ring to it. If it seems a stretch to draw a line from ancient alchemy to fiat money printing, consider 3 further factors. Firstly, as a historical matter, England's anti-alchemy law was repealed prior to the chartering of the Bank of England. Agents of the Invisible College, including Sir Robert Boyle, petitioned Parliament in 1688 for the passage of the Mines Royal Act. What did this act do? The Mines Royal Act repealed the 1404 Act Against Multipliers, in which then King Henry IV had made it a felony to create gold and silver by means of alchemy. With the anti-alchemy law off the books and out of the way, private banking interests were free to charter the Bank of England and initiate their literal money-making venture. Secondly, consider the possible hermetic interests of economist and mathematician John Maynard Keynes. It is difficult to understate Keynes's importance to the world we inhabit. His work on the so-called business cycle and its relationship to government and politics launched the modern discipline of macroeconomics. His theories about money creation were adopted as monetary policy in the United States and became the foundation for what is known as the American century. For our purposes, we observe that John Maynard Keynes was also one of the principal purchasers, through the famed auction house Sotheby's, of Sir Isaac Newton's treatises on alchemy. Thirdly, and more esoterically, we have the symbolic analysis of Freemasonic writer David Oveson. In his 2005 book, The Secrets of the Dollar Bill, Oveson connects the dollar sign with the alchemical caduceus, or wand of Hermes Mercury. The caduceus is normally depicted with two serpents entwined around a rod, sometimes with wings at the top. It is related to Moses' brazen serpent, frequently shown as a snake on a Tau cross. But even Oveson does not appear to have connected the dollar symbolism to the 18th century adventurer and alchemist Giuseppe Balsamo, who styled himself Count Alessandro Cagliostro. Cagliostro, one of our top 10 occultists of all time, produced a mystical emblem known as the Seal of Cagliostro, which has obvious relevance for this study. The seal was apparently subsequently incorporated into the logo of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, which sex magical group we mentioned in a previous video. As Oveson observed, the official symbol for the dollar sign, so reminiscent of Cagliostro's emblem, does not appear on the dollar bill itself. However, at least ostensibly, something like the Luxor hexagram, which was itself derived from the Kabbalistic Seal of Solomon, or Star of David, is detectable in the symbolism on the US dollar bill. Perhaps this was all predictable. After all, alchemy was said to have descended from the character Hermes. And among Hermes' grandiose titles was the god of commerce, as illustrated in a 16th century woodcut showing Mercury holding a pair of serpents in his right hand and a bag of money in his left. Could it be that, far from receding into the background as an irrelevant footnote in the catalog of pre-scientific superstition, alchemy has instead motivated the project of modern banking, upon which edifice Anglo-American and broader global corporate and governmental power rests? As a coda to this astonishing business, the respected magazine Scientific American almost offhandedly admits, quote, particle accelerators make possible the ancient alchemist's dream, and goes on to explain that nuclear physical transmutations are now performed routinely. But it turns out that you don't need the philosopher's stone to create money. All you need is a central bank. I hope to continue these ruminations in other videos, for example, by examining Wall Street's myriad connections to the occult and by exploring tantalizing, if frightening, points of contact with branches of the US military. But if you found something of interest in this presentation, please like the video. If you would enjoy seeing more content, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you would like to support the intensive research efforts that make this kind of content possible, consider becoming a patron via our new Patreon account. Patrons will receive the full 30-plus page text, including the 180 in-depth footnotes and all citations which was used to make this video. However, any interested viewer may read the script online for free at thesynchromystic.com.